Okay, guys, we're going to go ahead and kick off the 1930s. This was also known as the Great Depression. Let's go ahead and listen to some music.
When all the things you are mine. When the world is cold, I will feel a glow just thinking of you.
A tisket, a tasket, a brown and yellow basket. Bless America, land that I love.
Silent night, holy night.
Way over the rainbow, way up high.
What I'd like to do now is really get you in the feel of the Great Depression. So I'm going to play a video.
The Great Depression in America is one of the most defining moments of U.S. history. While there are a few key moments that shape the period, the cause is complex, distributed amongst several factors. Here are the top 5 causes. Stock market. The most noted cause of the Great Depression is the stock market crash on Black Tuesday, October 29, 1929. Americans lost $14 billion on that one day alone, and more than $40 billion in the following months. This is despite millions of dollars being pumped into the market to stabilize it. The collapse of the stock market would continue for 3 years before firmly regaining ground. Bank failures. In the first 10 months of 1930, 744 banks failed. Throughout the entire decade of the 1930s, 9,000 banks failed, and billions of dollars in depositor money went with them. Several factors converged to decimate the banking industry. Loss of money from Black Tuesday, massive withdrawal by frightened customers, defaults on loans, and their own poor investment practices. Ultimately, 4% of all money in the U.S. banks would disappear. Consumer spending. Prior to the onset of the Great Depression, the U.S. was already facing a downturn in consumer spending. With the stock market crash and bank failures, these cautionary consumer practices were dramatically increased, beginning a downward spiral where lack of demand for goods and services caused a drop in production, which in turn caused a decrease in the workforce. As unemployment rose, overall consumer capital fell, which further reduced consumer demand for goods and services. Tariff increases. As the global economy collapsed, governments protected themselves at the expense of other countries, a practice known as beggar thy neighbor. One major act in America was the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act, controversially passed June 17, 1930. This act radically increased U.S. import tariffs in an attempt to promote buying American. While there was a clear initial benefit, the retaliatory actions by other countries carrying out much of the same practice as the U.S. severely hurt American exports, which was especially damaging to the agricultural market. Drought. Plaguing the American Midwest in the 1930s, a long-term drought dried up lands and killed crops. The direct economic impact was individual inability to pay taxes and a widespread default on loans which crippled overextended banks. The people affected were often made homeless or displaced, forcing them to travel for work and creating the largest migration in U.S. history.
This is important for you to know for a couple of reasons. It's our history, and it impacted fashion during this decade in a major way. So the first thing that you see is, just by looking at these photos, that the drop waistline has disappeared from the 1920s. We are now back to the natural waistline where we were before. And just by looking at these dresses, we can see that hemlines have lowered. Typically, what happens in history is that hemlines will drop when the economy is doing poorly. The silhouette here is really a slight hourglass silhouette. It will be an hourglass silhouette on your exam, but you can see it is nothing like the exaggerated hourglass that we've had in the past. During this decade, when people were going through a very dreary and hard time of their life, they looked to the outside world for happiness. So they looked for films. And a lot of films in the 1930s didn't reflect what was going on in reality. Women were lavishly gowned and houses were magnificent. They were mansions that had all sorts of different furnishings on it. And off screen, the movie star became an influencer. And this is super important to note because this is the first time that we have celebrity influence. Women actually started to bleach their hair blonde in imitation of Jean Harlow, and thousands of mothers curled their daughter's hair into ringlets like Shirley Temple. So this is Jean Harlow right here. She was America's original blonde bombshell. Everyone thinks of Marilyn Monroe like that, but this is Jean Harlow. She created the look, okay? She was the sex symbol of the 1930s. She died at 26 from kidney failure. She died very young because she was dyeing her hair constantly on a weekly basis. Shirley Temple, however, right here, she was a child star and started filming when she was only 3 years old. She was America's darling of the Great Depression. So these two, America was looking at and trying to imitate it in their own homes the best way that they could. The dresses of the 1930s for women, they were cut on the bias. So if we look at this right here, we're going to pretend like this is a piece of fabric. This is not the print of the fabric. This is how the fabric was put together. It was woven together, okay? So you can see one thread going under, one thread going over, one thread going under, one thread going over, okay? So it was woven together. What you get in fabric is called a bias, which is a 45-degree angle throughout the fabric. And what that does is it gives the fabric more stretch. So you're getting a lot more bang for your buck if you cut things on the fabric because you can stretch it. And if we look at the dresses, I wouldn't say that they're terribly tight, but you get a lot of drapeability down below, and they are a little bit tighter up top. Okay, especially if you're wearing a dress like what Jean Harlow is wearing. Okay, hair and makeup also became pretty big. Similar to the wavy 1920s bob that you saw, your hair is going to be a little bit longer, a little bit curlier, a little bit softer, and it's worn with a side or a middle part. If you had longer hair, then you would pull it back at the nape of your neck. Makeup usually included foundation, nails with a matte finish, and a little bit of lip color. They went for thinner or frosty eyebrows, thin or curved eyebrows, like nothing like what you see today where our eyebrows are pretty thick. These are very thin, almost pencil thin. Foundation and powder were always pale. It was very ivory. And if you wore rouge on your cheeks, it would be very light pink or a light coral, just a hint of blush, not a whole lot. And you would do a deep color for your lips. It would be a darker color, light eyeshadow, a little bit of eyeshadow, not a lot. And it was always a neutral shade. And if you did liner, some people did, it would be dark brown or black, and lots of mascara or false eyelashes. That was only for the evening time, not during the day. And you would get a moon manicure, which is the like French white tip manicure, and pink or lighter. You never went darker than that. So we're going to watch this ad. This is all about hairstyles in the 1930s.
The elaborate Rumba Swirl for the most formal dinner and dance occasion. And the Terminal, simple enough for the hostess, yet formal enough for evening wear. La Nimrée, for afternoon as well as evening wear, designed especially for the young girl. Enter the Duchess. This attractive new headdress is appropriately named the Merry Widow. Another romantic night with a regal and glamorous appearance, suitable for first nights in the opera. And now off for the show, all five, and not a worry in the world about getting a single hair out of place.
Hand-me-downs. Repair, reuse, make do, and don't throw anything away. That was the motto of the Great Depression, because many people didn't have everything that they needed. They would just use what they had, and they would reuse it until it couldn't be reused anymore. Very few families had enough money to buy new clothes at a store, and mothers would mend their socks and sew patches over holes in clothing. The elbow patch jacket, I don't know if it's very popular right now, but it has been in the past, where you see patches over the elbow. That came from the Great Depression. Clothing was recycled or reused, as younger children may do with hand-me-downs. So the older children, they had to have new clothes, or their mothers would make them clothing, and the younger children would get whatever the older children outgrew. So you can see here, this is kind of imitating the fashion of the 1930s of what children would be wearing. Children actually got feed sack or sack clothing. So the trend of flour sack clothing started in the late 20s, when women at home realized that they could upcycle the material of the sacks of clothing for themselves and their families. The flour sacks at that time were not paper, okay? They were actual canvas-like fabric. And the trend grew in the Depression in the 1930s because people couldn't afford clothing anymore. And the flour sack industry actually caught up to the trend and started releasing different pattern sacks and novelty prints. And so women would make like dolls for their kids, and they would make clothing for their children. They would use them as washcloths. They reused everything, including the sack that their flour came in. And so some women would want a particular brand based on the different pattern that a brand was releasing, okay?
In the 1940s, my mother was making our clothes, and we'd go to the granary with my grandmother and my mother, and we could pick out these feed sacks that were its clothing, because until that point, we wore what mother made, but a feed sack we could choose, so that was like going to the mall. I mean, you could pick out this 100-pound bag of flour, and you knew you were going to get a dress or a son's dress or something from it. Three bags, 100-pound bags that I'm showing you, would make a lady's dress. 4 to 5 would do a quilt. So that's how the women would gauge it. It was a very, very intense, important time in our history. And it all started, the prints on all these sacks, and they made over 60,000 different prints, started as a marketing ploy. It was made to sell more sacks. Percy Kent wanted to sell more because the women of the house, the farmer goes, he gets his feed, and she wants her flour or rice or whatever, and that way she could have them by having these prints.
All right, guys, so you can really see this woman lived this as a little girl. Her mother, like she said, would take her and she would pick out the print for her dress. It's a very, very, very interesting point in our American history. So we're going to switch gears into men's clothing. So the inverted triangle silhouette, that's what men were going for here, and you can really see it in their suits. So the double-breasted suit became very popular, and remember that double-breasted just means that there's 2 rows of buttons, okay? Pinstripe suits were very popular at this time, and they had padded shoulders, which gave the man a more inverted triangle look. And remember, an inverted triangle, his shoulders are wider than the hips. A Glen plaid fabric also became popular, and this is a woolen fabric that has a twill design of small and large checks. So we can look at it here. This is a smaller check, and then this would be the larger check. Okay, again, larger check, smaller check. Glen plaid colors typically were black and white and gray, muted colors, neutrals. The signature pattern has 2 dark stripes over 2 light stripes that alternate with 4 dark stripes over 4 light stripes, and that creates that cross pattern of irregular checks. So you can see the larger check versus the smaller check. And that was what men were wanting to wear if they weren't wearing pinstripes. So really, I want to show you these photos because they demonstrate that inverted triangle really, really well. And it is kind of hard when they were wearing their coats like this. You can see it's more rectangular. But if you look at this man right here, you can see his shoulders have pads in the suit jacket. And what that does is it makes his waist look smaller than his shoulders. Do you see that? It's really hard when you see the whole jacket on. You've got to really just figure out where the man's waist is, and then you can see it.